Welcome to the world's greatest show. And we are back with a brand new unit. So if you are not super enthralled with the genetics unit, then you probably will find this one a little bit more tolerable. Well, maybe. But anyways, we're now on to evolution. And evolution is one of the aspects of biology that is more evidence-based. And even though we're fairly confident in the theory, there still is a lot that we are learning about it. So evolution is based on evidence. And we are going to explore some of that evidence, and we're going to see how it helps to show that the theory of evolution is valid. So it isn't really something we can test in a lab. We have computer models, but we can't really analyze it under a microscope. But we can use certain factors of evidence in order to show that the theory is sound. Okay, so let's go ahead and get at it. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the raw definition of evolution. So what exactly is evolution? Well, for starters, it is considered to be change over time. So evolution is simply change over time. Now, everything changes over time. The question is how does it change? So for evolution, we kind of tinker this a bit to be change over time in response to environmental stressors. So that's basically evolution. And evolution is the reason why life looks like it does. If anything is on the earth currently, and we haven't overhunted it, overfished it, or otherwise just overkilled it to reduce numbers or to extinction, it is here because how it looks gave it a survival advantage in the environment. Because basically, animals are constantly competing with each other. Well, animals, life forms in general, are always competing with each other. And that brings in the idea of natural selection. So natural selection, I've kind of dialed down the definition to adaptations accumulated, sorry for that messed up word, accumulated over time that confer a survival advantage in a specific environment. In a specific environment, with keyword on specific. So in other words, the environment chooses what survives. So it is environment specific. I say this because an organism that has a great ability to survive in the Arctic probably wouldn't have such a great advantage in a forested region. Or maybe something that lives in an area where there's lots of nuts and seeds or worms, which is perfect food for a bird, probably wouldn't survive so well in an area where there is mainly large mammals or rodents. So the environment chooses what survives. So basically, the environment weeds out, if you want to use that term, weeds out organisms that are not fit to survive. And more or less, the most fit organisms have the greatest amount of offspring. So I'm going to go ahead and just type this here. So the most fit organisms have the most offspring. Since DNA is unique to each and every organism, when they reproduce, they are going to pass down their genes to the subsequent generation. So they pass down unique genes, which, if you recall from genetics, alleles, unique genes to next generation. This is extremely beneficial because then the offspring have a pretty good chance of inheriting a trait that will give them a survival advantage. Now, let's talk about this term adaptation. So adaptation is a trait an organism evolves that gives it a survival advantage in environment. There's several different types of adaptations. For example, you could have coat color that blends with the environment. That's an example. You could have stealthy hunting technique. I know that's vague, but you get the idea. You could have ability to burrow. I mean, you're seeing here that things that animals do to survive are called adaptations because they had to evolve them over time. Excuse me. Oh, I hate that feeling when you think you're gonna sneeze and you don't, but thankfully I didn't, or else I would be sanitizing my laptop and my wonderful drawing tablet. Okay, so if you want some examples of evolution, I'll gladly give you some. Okay, so let's say that I start a new rule. What if I say that only students that answer their discussion questions in 4 or more sentences will be allowed to stay in the course? Now, many of you are going to be very disappointed because you would be disenrolling, and I probably would get some very bad feedback on my evaluations, which I think you guys were supposed to fill out. Yeah. Well, anyways, I'm not sure if you still can. Don't worry, I'm not going to make you drop the course if you don't have 4 sentences for your discussion questions. But anyways, what if I made that rule? Well, in that case, quite a bit of our class population would be weeded out from the population. Now, why did this happen? Well, because me, the environment, decided to make a change that affected which individuals could stay in the course. It was just a random thing that happened. I woke up one day, I was so tired of reading discussion questions that were only like a sentence or two long. I got fed up. Maybe if I won the lotto, that would end up happening, but that hasn't happened yet. So bad mood. Woke up, terrible mood. But you're seeing here that it's nothing really that you did. It is just the way that the environment, me, decided to respond. Reminds me of a great quote from Captain Picard in Star Trek. Sometimes you can do everything right and still fail. That's not failure. That's called life. Um, yeah. Well, I know that that sounds harsh, but in the animal kingdom, ladies and gentlemen, that is very harsh. All right. So what about an adaptation? All right. Now, adaptations result from random genetic mutations. So adaptations result from random mutations. The thing with evolution that you have to keep in mind is we're not talking on scales of human lifespans. We're not talking in scales of days or weeks or years. We're talking in scales of hundreds of thousands to millions of years. Um, Now, we see evolution in an abbreviated way with viruses and bacteria because since they reproduce so fast and they don't have the ability to proofread the replicated DNA and RNA, they tend to mutate pretty fast and change. So in other words, these adaptations result from mutations which are mistakes in replicating DNA. In replicating DNA. Now, I do want to say that most mutations, 99 point, probably 99.9% of them, actually result in diminished function. Meaning that what they do is that they mutate and they either inhibit the function of the protein or otherwise make the protein completely non-functional. So most mutations, so I'll say that 90, and this is not proven, but I'm just saying this off the top of my head, 99.9% of mutations diminish, it's not how you spell it, diminish, or inhibit function. In other words, most mutations just work to break the protein. Obviously, that is not good for survival. However, once in a great while, you'll have a mutation that actually gives a survival advantage. So this is a random mistake that just happened to make the protein function even better. Think about it like this: you go to Wendy's or whatever. You order a chocolate frosty. So you get your frosty, it's vanilla. At first you're upset, but then you're like, well, I don't feel like going back inside. You taste the vanilla frosty, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is so much better. And you discover that you love the vanilla frosty. It's made your life so much better, so much more happy and fulfilled. Now that was an accident. Maybe instead of that chocolate frosty, maybe you would have gotten, like, I don't know, a cherry Coke, and you would have been like, this is nasty. I'm never coming back here again, or something similar. So in this case, it was a complete mistake that just happened to make your life a bit better. Well, that's basically with mutations. Normally, when you get the wrong order, you're very unhappy. You're very unhappy. You're like, this is disgusting. It's nasty. Um, but once in a while, it will actually make things a little bit better. To give you an example here, we'll have the SARS-2 virus, the virus that causes COVID-19. So we'll say that this is the starting strain. So this is the Wuhan strain, or the strain that was isolated in the Wuhan province. And we'll say that it infects you. I'll just say 61% of the time, exposure causes infection. Now, all viruses mutate at a pretty rapid rate. The SARS-2 virus actually has an ability to slightly proofread its DNA, so it doesn't make mistakes quite as often. Sorry, I think it's an RNA-based virus. I'll have to double check though. But it has a ability to slightly proofread its genetic material. So it doesn't make mistakes all that often. But when it does, usually it creates a non-functional virus. You never know that these were made because they don't do anything. You'll have maybe one or two made from a mutation, and then the rest will just die off because they can't affect cells. On occasion, though, you might have a variant that does exactly the same. So variant 1 might have same same infection rate. Okay, great. So it changed, but it didn't really do anything. And then you can have variants. I'll just say variant 2. And this one actually can infect now 78% of the time. Exposure causes infection. Now, why is this? Well, that's because the spike protein, which is found on the surface of the virus, actually can get into cells better than the starting strain. Now, there's a couple of viral variants that have this adaptation. The South African virus, the UK variant, and the Brazilian virus. So those different variants, they actually have mutations that can help it get into the cell better. But keep in mind, out of the well over, and I haven't checked the case counts, well over 1 million people that have been infected, more than that, I think it might be 10 million by now, that have had confirmed infections. We've only had 3 variants that have actually had increased infectability. That just shows you the vast majority of mutations create something that is non-functional. And keep in mind, viruses mutate at such a faster rate than multi-celled life forms. So it's very hard to see evolution in action with complex animal life. Now, if you want another example, this is a cheesy example that I call Giraffe Island. And Giraffe Island is actually an island filled with giraffes. And there's 3 kinds of vegetation on Giraffe Island. We have small bushes, we have medium-sized trees, and then we have tall trees. It's a very tall tree. Very tall. Now, there are 3 variants of giraffe on the islands. So first of all, we have medium neck giraffe. So we have medium neck giraffe. It's a good animal. It's a good old giraffe. Have a lifespan of about 25 years, in case you're curious. And this giraffe is actually perfect at reaching this medium-sized tree. Now, on the other side, we have bulldog neck giraffe. Here's a little giraffe. This has a short, stubby neck. So I guess it kind of is like a giraffe dog. And you see here that bulldog neck giraffe is perfectly situated to eat the whatever grows on the bush. Now, on the other hand, we have accordion neck giraffe. Accordion neck giraffe. And you see here that it is perfectly situated to go get the tall tree. Now, the reason why these three giraffes can live in harmony on the island is because their unique adaptations allowed it to develop a niche where they have a certain food source where there's no competition. So therefore, their niches, which is basically the roles that they fulfill in their environment. We'll talk about that later. Niches do not overlap. Now we see here that the accordion neck giraffe can't really outcompete the medium neck giraffe or the medium tree because it needs to, crink its neck, and it's not advantageous. The medium neck giraffe will be able to outcompete it every time. And the long neck and the accordion neck giraffe doesn't have a chance to get the bush because, well, um, picture if if you tied your hands behind your back, and then I put a bowl of oatmeal on the ground and I told you to eat it. You can't you can't sit down though. You have to keep standing because giraffes can't exactly sit down and ask you, hey, go eat that oatmeal. Even if you're really hungry, you can't get it. Well, so the accordion neck giraffe can't go after the bulldog neck giraffe's bush. Okay, so it's perfectly situated. It's perfectly designed through years of evolution. It's developed an adaptation that allows it to have its own food source. Medium neck giraffe is the same. It has evolved over X number of years. It has developed an adaptation, a medium neck, that lets it eat the medium-sized tree. And if there's in a and possibly if there's an emergency situation, maybe it could get the bush. I don't know. And now we have bulldog neck giraffe. No one's going to outcompete it for the bush. But on the negative side, it can't reach the tree or the super big tree. Now, as long as the environment does not change, these three giraffes, um, with their different traits, can survive in harmony. But one day, disaster strikes. It's a bad day on Giraffe Island. A fungus decimates the population bushes, and a tornado rips out all the tall trees. What bad luck! Luckily, though, the long-necked giraffe was able to seek shelter somewhere. So now what's happened is that the environment has changed. We now have no more small bushes and no more super big trees. So now what has happened is that the accordion neck giraffe and the bulldog neck giraffe now are not do not have an advantage in surviving in the environment. Bulldog neck giraffe cannot jump up and eat the tree, certainly can't outcompete the medium neck giraffe for the medium tree, and the accordion neck giraffe, it has no ability to outcompete the medium neck giraffe for food because the tree's too small. So over time, we are going to see that the accordion neck giraffe and the bulldog neck giraffe are going to be eliminated from the population. They can't find food, and over time, they will not be able to survive in the environment. And what's going to happen is that medium neck giraffe is going to become um, the dominant type of giraffe. So this is the idea of natural selection. Natural selection, I guess you can say that the environment chooses. All right, so now what I'm going to do is we are going to talk about evidence of evolution. Evidence for evolution. And if we are going to talk about it, there's a couple. And the first thing we are going to talk about is fossils. So fossils are bones and other remains that are in a similar area that have familiarity. I think I spelled that wrong. So what does that mean? Well, let's say here that we have a plot of land, and on this plot of land we have horses here. Today the horses are purple. All right, actually, let me go ahead and clear this. So we have a plot of land. On this land live some horses. They're, yeah, good old horses. Okay, so these horses are going to be turquoise today. So this is your modern horse. Now, let's go ahead and analyze the femur and the tooth of the modern horse. So we'll go ahead and say that the femur, we'll just say that it is going to be, I don't know, I'll just say it's going to be, I don't know, 25 centimeters. And we are going to see the horse's tooth, and the horse's tooth is actually rather flat because it's designed to grind. So it is meant for grinding, and it's ideal for a vegetarian diet. Even though some of my students who are equestrians, one of them feeds her horse. She said that she fed it a ham sandwich. I'm like, well, I guess horses maybe are not exactly herbivores. All right, now let's say that there is a dig site, we'll call this A, that's fairly near the surface, and they find fossils in here. And they find that there is a hind leg, a femur in here, that is a little bit smaller, but looks very similar to the one in modern horses. We'll say that is 20 centimeters. And let's say that the tooth is still designed for grinding, but it's a little bit sharper. So it's designed for grinding still, but it also is sharper. And that says shaper. And scientists are like, huh, well, that's interesting. The only reason why it would be sharper is if the horse was possibly a meat eater, because sharp teeth are designed for tearing and ripping. All right, so they decide to dig a little bit more. We'll say this B. And guess what? They find more fossils. So now they find a femur that's a little bit shorter again. So we'll say that it's 16 centimeters. And they find a tooth that's just a little bit sharper. No, that's a scary horse tooth. So now they're like, wait a second, these bones have very similar shapes, but they're getting progressively shorter and the teeth are getting progressively sharper. Now let's say they dig some more, and now they're in C, and this time they find that the leg is shorter again. We'll say it's 12 centimeters, and the tooth now is very sharp. So it is designed for ripping and tearing, giving strong evidence that the early horses were actually meat eaters. So what they can do now is, based on the bones, they actually can recreate what they think the early horses look like. So they probably draw something that kind of looks like this. This is probably what the ancient horses look like. Little squatty dog-like creatures with really sharp teeth. Those are sharp teeth. There we go. Very angry, hungry little horse creature. So this is why whenever you see like, oh, this is what dinosaurs look like, for example. What they're doing is they're taking the bone structures and what they know about the Earth during that time period, and they're actually able to come up with an assumption on what the animal looked like. By the way, it would be horrifying to see a creature like this in today's society. Just picture trying to go up to this little horse-like animal that looks kind of like a baby horse, and then just having it open its mouth and just see rows of canines. That'd be horrifying, especially if it could unhinge its jaw like a hippopotamus. That would be horrifying. All right, so basically what happens is that fossils found in similar areas that are similar in size and shape, what they can do is compare those and see similarities and see how they've changed going from modern era down to years past. And then they can see, okay, well, they can find trends in how the bones were in the ancient past for that animal. All right, next is going to be genetic similarities. So with genetic similarities, similarities, I can't spell today. So genetic similarities. So using one common gene, researchers can compare how similar the genetic, it's not how you spell genetic, the genetic coding is. So using one common gene, researchers can compare how similar the genetic coding is. So what we can do is take a gene like the hemoglobin beta subunit gene, which codes for a protein that makes up the hemoglobin protein. Now, I want to see how similar the horse, great ape, zebrafish, antelope are. So you have to choose one species to compare everything to. So I'm going to choose the horse. We'll go ahead and say that the horse's sequence is going to be ATG, CCA, AAA. Now let's say that the great ape has this sequence here, AGCC, AAA. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show changes here in pink. So we'll go ahead and do. So if you look here, there are two differences between the great ape and the horse. Right now, I'm just choosing to compare everything to the horse, but we can also compare different species too. Now let's say for the zebrafish, we're going to go T, G, C, C, A, A. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do instead T, G, G. So if we look here, there's actually 3 differences between the zebrafish and the horse. Now if we do the antelope, We'll go A, T, G, C, C, A, C. Now, comparing it to the horse, we see that there's only one difference, one nucleotide difference between the horse and the antelope. Now, okay, but backtrack. How mutations work is that using a series of very complex mathematical models, is researchers can plug it into an equation and figure out approximately how many years needs to go by for mutations to occur. So these are computer models, and they can say, okay, every 300,000 years, a mutation will occur that will, it's very complex. So what they can do is take the gene of an antelope and take the gene of a horse and plug it into a computer, and they can actually figure out how many years it's been based on that gene, how many years it's been since the antelope and the horse were the same common species. We'll talk more about that later. What we see here, just counting the differences, is that the antelope and the horse are very similar to each other because there's only one nucleotide difference. Since the more time goes by, since they were a common ancestor, the more mutations there are, we can assume since there's only one mutation that the horse and the antelope are not too far from each other, meaning that it wasn't super long ago since they were a common ancestor. We see the zebrafish and the horse, there's 3 differences in their codes. That means that it's been quite a while since the horse and the zebrafish were a common species. And we see the great ape has 2, so we see that yes, there has been some time since the horse and the great ape were a common species, but not as long as since the horse and the zebrafish were a common species. So basically, what you can do is that by choosing one species as a baseline, you can compare how similar species are to each other. So if we see the great ape and the zebrafish, we see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 differences between the great ape and the zebrafish. So we can see here that the great ape and the zebrafish are not anything alike. So I know this is really complex, but long story short is that the more mutations there are in the same gene across different species, the longer it's been since they were a common ancestor. Okay, so with that in mind, backtrack a bit. We assume that at one time, all life started off as a single cell. Then over time, it diverged and diverged and diverged and diverged. So at one point, we think that all animals were the same exact species. Then it separated into multiple species and multiple species and multiple species. So it kept on diverging, and that's how we've arrived at life today. Okay, cool. So that is genetic similarities. And now we're going to move on to the next evidence of evolution. If I can get this up, and we have homology. Probably best that I switch to the PowerPoint for this one because my drawing abilities can kind of get a bit limited at times. All right, so if we look here, we are going to see homology. Now let's go ahead and look here what we see. Well, the idea of homology is we can see how closely related species are by analyzing their bone structures. Now, function does not matter. We don't care what the function is. We care about the structure. Now, if we look here at the human, cat, whale, and bat limbs, we see that they're made up of similar bones. Even though they have different functions, they're made up of similar bones. So based on that, we can say, well, why is it that they have similar bones? Why do we have similar bones? And the answer is, or the reasonable assumption is that at one time, we were the same species, once upon a time ago. Now, this doesn't tell us, like genetic similarities, approximately how long it's been since we were a common species, but it does show that at one time we were the same species. Now, of course, the greater the bony differences are, the more time it's been since we were a common species. If you were to analyze the bone structure of a fish compared to a human, you'd see that it's been a long, long time. But if you compare a human to a bat or a human to a cat, you'll see that there are enough similarities to say that, hey, at one time, maybe not that long ago, well, talking in terms of hundreds of thousands of years, we were the same species. Now we'll come back here, but analogous structures do not show evidence of evolution. And we'll get to that in a bit. All right, since I'm on here, might as well continue on to embryology. It's interesting. If you are to look at a mature human, bird, reptile, and fish, you would say they are very different species. But if you look at their appearances during the embryonic stage, you'll actually see that humans, birds, reptiles, and fish actually look very similar in their embryonic stages. In fact, humans actually develop gills and tails during their embryonic stage, just like fish, reptiles, and birds. And even though humans replace them with lungs, it still is a question of why are the embryos so similar? And the only assumption that can make sense is that at one time, we were the same species. So why do we still have the same appearance during the embryonic stages? Very good question. But the fact that they're so similar shows that, hey, something happened and we came from the same ancestor, possibly. And last of all are vestigial structures. These are bone structures that are so small that they don't really serve any functional purpose. Or they're still present, but they still serve no functional purpose. Now, whales have hip bones. And you have to ask, well, why? Why would whales need super tiny hip bones that don't do anything? Well, this tells us at one time, whales were land animals. And they actually had legs, they had limbs. Something happened where they had to evolve to live in water, to become aquatic animals. As you can imagine, whales with legs were not super aerodynamic. So over time, if there was a mutation that made the legs smaller, it was an adaptation that gave the whale a better survival advantage because it could swim better. And over time, those legs got so small, they pretty much disappeared. In fact, as you can see here, they did. And because of that, whales lost their limbs and became very efficient seafaring animals. We see the same thing with humans in the tailbone. When we became bipedal, meaning that we decided to start walking around on two legs and not on all fours, a tail became a liability. it isn't exactly beneficial if you're trying to run a hungry animal and you're running and you trip over your tail. Okay, not good. Things also can grab your tail. Okay, really not good. So over time, humans that through random mutations developed shorter and shorter tails, they actually had a better survival advantage until the best possible outcome was a tail that really disappeared. Now the tailbone is just there for us to bruise and be miserable for a couple days. I actually had tailbone tendonitis at one time. That was miserable. And you know what the cause was? I found out that the cause through trial and error was vitamin D deficiency. So every time that my tailbone starts to ache, I know that I'm low on vitamin D, which is crazy. Yeah, vitamin D deficiency does bad things. Make sure to have your vitamin D levels tested and supplement if necessary. You also have biogeography. I don't think I have a slide here for biogeography, but basically how it works is, since I'm on the PowerPoint side of things, so let me look up biogeography, see if I can find an image. Biogeography. Oh, it popped right up. The idea here is we have to ask ourselves, well, okay, well, this is nice. We like ostriches. Okay, if we look here, this is not the best image in the world. Let me find a better one. Okay, now let's say that we find, here, let me look up lizards. All right, I might have a little bit of a hard time finding this, but let's say that across the globe, we find several different varieties of reptiles. We see that they look very similar, but they're actually scattered all throughout the globe. We have to ask ourselves, well, how did that happen? Did they just randomly evolve to be extremely genetically similar and be very similar, but just on completely different parts of the globe? What the assumption is that at one time the Earth, the land structures were either all one giant mass or very, very close together. And because of that, species were able to easily pass from one land mass to another. As time went on and these land masses separated more, the species stayed on there and continued to evolve. So what this means is that the fact that there's such similar life forms on drastically different parts of the world, that tells us that, hey, okay, at one time, these land masses were much closer together. Now, over time, they've separated, but at one time they were much closer together, and species were more easily able to transverse from one side of the globe to the other. So now we're going to talk about things that are not evidence of evolution. And the first thing, going back to our PowerPoint, the first thing that is not evidence of evolution is called artificial selection. Now, what happens here? Well, what happens is that you take life forms that have traits that you want. For example, for livestock, especially chicken farms and things like that, of course, the bigger the chicken grows, the more meat can be produced, and the more money the farm makes. So what they did is that they took chickens, and they took the biggest and largest chickens, and they kept on having them reproduce. Over time, random mutations made the chickens bigger and bigger and bigger, until the common chicken now is 4,200 grams, which is about, I think, close to 10 pounds, I think, if I'm doing my math correctly, 7, 8 pounds at least. And this did not happen because it gave the chicken a survival advantage. If these 2005 chickens were ever to try and survive in the wild, they're not suitable for any environment because any kind of predator will have a big walking meatball in order to feast on. Plus, their legs are so thin they can basically snap because they were not designed to hold that much weight. So artificial selection does not give a survival advantage; it gives a profit advantage. Domesticated dogs are another example of artificial selection, especially ones like French bulldogs that cannot give birth naturally. They need to give birth via cesarean. Next, we have analogous structures. Now, if we look here on the outside, they look similar and they actually have the same function. But if you analyze their bone structures, they look completely different. What this means is that where these animals evolved, there is only one shape that worked. There is only one appearance that worked. And if this appearance wasn't exactly the optimal design, then it just wouldn't work, and natural selection would weed out that animal. So what that means is that all aquatic life forms had to develop things that functioned as fins, or else they would not survive in the environment. I think of it like planes. With planes, one design works. If you look at planes from all different manufacturers, they all have a similar appearance. And it's because that's the only design that works. So analogous structures have the same function, but the structure is completely different. And it's because that the animals that live in a certain area, they have to develop structures that fit this role, or else they'll not be able to survive. And the last one not on this PowerPoint is genetic modification. And genetic modification is um, where you can actually take a gene and put it in the DNA of an organism, and that will actually give it a desired trait. So if we're going to look here, we can look at golden rice. They actually take a gene that's from a daffodil that can create beta carotene and splice it into the genome of rice. What this does is it allows the rice to make beta carotene, which converts to vitamin A, which is valuable in areas where there's vitamin A deficiency. You also can take out genes that cause fruits to ripen. Thus, they stay fresh longer. Let me see, am I sharing this with you? Here we go. We also have BT corn that actually makes a natural pesticide that resists pest species that eat it. We actually genetically modify salmon to grow bigger and faster using additional growth hormone. And we even can take animals and put in a gene that allows them to glow in the dark. Why? There's no real reason why. Scientists just think it's cool, I guess. So genetic modification is not an example of natural evolution because it is manipulated. Well, two of them are manipulated by humans, and with analogous structures, it's deceptive. It is not really evolution because they aren't related. It just is a structure that needs to be there in order for the life form to survive. I will hope you all enjoyed this lecture, and especially always remember the legend of Giraffe Island. And yeah, I hope you all have taken the test and the lab exam. If you haven't, well, now's your grand opportunity to. All right. Any questions? Reach out. See you all later.